from Yu Who, and I am here to review God, A Human History by Reza Aslan. First of all, I want to say that the title isn't quite accurate. It's a human prehistory and history, which actually is significantly more intriguing to me, because I just got my degree in anthropology. So prehistory holds a significantly more fonder part of my heart. In fact, the first third of the entire book, the first part, is almost entirely prehistory. So the author has a degree in religious studies, but the majority of sites that he sources are anthropological, and I can definitely vouch for the first third of the book. Basic anthropology, they teach you a lot of the sites that he references, and even there's a few controversies that some people might disagree with, which I'll get into a little bit later on. For the most part, he's very straightforward and stays within the normal range of academia. Because he's from academia, his book writes as if you're in a lecture hall, which it's very easy to read. It's not like other academic writing. It's very smooth and easy to understand. Basically because the way that it's ordered is very similar to how you would order a regular class. So I'm going to go chapter by chapter and give you my take on it. The first part is the introduction, and like a good social scientist, he goes over his bias. He was raised Pakistani. He was raised in America by Pakistani parents and in a Muslim household. He eventually switched over to Christianity and then went into religious studies with a main focus on Islam. He gives a little bit of a hint in the first part, in the introduction, about how he views that the ideal way to view God is in a dehumanized form, which is interesting, and it leads you to a couple of questions about like what you're going to be reading, and is this going to be preachy or anything like that. I didn't find the book to be preachy. I found that it stayed very scientific, except for a little bit in the conclusion, but I didn't really take any offense to any of it. It was very much stayed in the scientific realm. So chapter 1 is titled Adam and Eve in Eden, which for me, my first reaction is like, oh my god, getting right into Christianity. It is not! Adam and Eve is the terminology that he uses for early humans, not just Homo sapiens, but he does reference some Neanderthals and occasionally Homo erectus, and he considers all of that just in the category of Adam and Eve just early human. All dealing in archaeology and prehistory. Yeah. Then he goes into chapter 2, Lord of the Beasts, where he talks about how religion could possibly be a genetic trait and how cognitively we could have come to the understanding of religion. This is mainly like early theory on how evolution could have led us to believe in religion. This is more like when you go into a class and you learn the theory before the current theory. He does some functionalism. He talks a little bit about Durkheim. Basically just the history of theory. Chapter 3 is significantly more interesting. I learned about something that I didn't know before. It's called Hypersensitive Agency Detection Device. The little acronym, because of course everything has to have an acronym, is HADD. They've identified it like genetically and cognitively, that's like psychology's job. That isn't really anthropology job, that's psychology job. Where they've noticed that humans will identify something as a predator that isn't by mistake. So, for example, if you're walking in the woods and you see a tree, but in your mind it's a predator and you freak out and you run away, it's more evolutionary safe for us to be more cautious of these things and to assume that a predator is there than to not react if a predator actually is there. So we're hypersensitive to the idea that like something might come in to attack us. So he goes into this like long thing about how this tree, a person could be afraid it's a predator and they might see a face, and that face gives it these human traits. And then he talks about theory of mind, which is very well established theory that humans see the intention of other humans. Basically, when they say walk a mile in somebody else's shoes, it's usually thought of to be both an adult trait and an inherently human trait, but evidence has, I'm not getting into this book, evidence has shown that it could also be evident that they can also be present in non-human primates, and that it could also possibly be present in children. That's still highly debated. But theory of mind is the idea that you understand what somebody else is thinking because you've experienced something similar. So if somebody's crying, you understand they're sad because when you cry, you're sad. So with this instance of the tree, when you accidentally view the tree as a predator and see a face on it, you then give it human characteristics. You then see it as like, oh, this tree might be judging me, this tree might like talk to me, this tree might have feelings, and all these human traits that you devote to that tree, and this then creates a concept of a soul, right? The concept that like a tree can think and have feelings. So chapter 3 is basically saying that like religion might have been accidental due to the cognitive processes that we have. So that's part 1. Part 2, if I were to summarize part 2, it's like explaining how prehistory like turns into history. It's talking a lot about the development of agriculture, and it's talking a lot about the Fertile Crescent. Yeah, so chapter 4, Spears into Plows, is talking about how myths are a product of a social construct, and that they usually have an element of truth to them. Basically that myths are oral traditions that can be morphed to fit our time just as any other social construct. He also talks about how agriculture changed our view on both animals and plants, which then reflected into our religious practices about how when we're just the tree who has a face, who can talk to us, and all these things, that we had a connection with that tree in a very positive sense. But now that we are doing domestication and we have power and control over our environment and over animals, it creates this level of dominance in our culture, which then reflects in our religion. Lofty Persons, chapter 5, is talking primarily about Mesopotamia, and about how they were polytheic and how they practiced ancestor worship. And this is all about, all 3 chapters I'm talking about right now are about humanizing God. So the fact that your ancestors go to become God is the most obvious way that you would humanize God, is that you have an actual person who you knew or who your mother knew, who is up in the sky looking at you. It's very tangible. And right now, during this time, it's all about making God tangible. He also goes a little bit into talking about the Egyptian gods and the Greek gods. So, also in chapter 5, he talks about how this can backfire of having all of these gods, especially within the Greek culture, having the huge pantheon of gods who feel very human feelings to the point where it seems like they're not even gods anymore, that they're dealing with all of these petty things, having all of this tedious aspects of life, that it can make the culture feel like they aren't real, that they're just like the same as us. Chapter 6 is called The High God, still in part 2 about humanizing God. Is starting about talking about the radical concept of monotheism. Monotheism isn't explained fully in this part. It's mainly expressed in its failures, because when monotheism is first starting out, it's just constant failure. People just don't like the idea of monotheism, and he explains why. The main issue with it, though, is that in order to be entirely monotheistic, and not a couple of other terms that he describes, is that you have to believe that not only do you worship one God, but that no other God exists. And this is very hard for people to understand because they're used to having a huge plethora of gods, and sometimes they would only worship to one God, but that didn't mean that they denied the existence of others. So in order to get somebody to be monotheistic, they need to both shut out their current belief and adopt another one, which is extremely radical. He talks about 2 examples, one in Egypt and one in Iran. In Egypt, so that everybody knows, like the classic case of, what's his name? The father of King Tut. I always forget his father's name. Oh, Akutataten. I don't know. I'm not going to try to pronounce this. Yeah, I'm not going to try to pronounce that. I'm just going to butcher it. He goes around, like, 1500. Let me get the exact year. His reign started in the year 1353 BCE, which he tried to erase all the other gods and just have one exclusive sun god. And this lasted for his reign. He had a strong military force to take down temples, to make sure that people are punished if they're practicing and worshiping other gods. So he very much like strong-armed them. The issue with this is that the moment he died, people went crazy and just obliterated almost all evidence of him. They got rid of all evidence of his god. It's amazing that there's any archaeological record left of it. And they went back to practicing their polytheistic ways. Basically, like, don't try to force someone to believe something. It's not going to work. Then he talks about how in Iran they have another example. This guy wasn't a king or anything. He couldn't force monotheism onto anyone, and it was ultimately a failure because people just didn't get it. Then we go to chapter 7, which is part 3. Part 3 is called What is God? And part 3 is dealing, each chapter, the first one is dedicated to Judaism, then Christianity, then Islam. So God is One is chapter 7, is talking about Judaism, which is super, super interesting. I had no idea about this. So he talks about how the Israelites actually did not practice monotheism. They practiced a different form. What exactly is the word? I don't remember exactly the word that it was, but it basically means that they worshipped one god but did not deny the existence of other gods. At this time, there was a lot of tribal warfare, and each tribe had a god that they worshipped, and if one tribe overtook another, it was another sign that that god was stronger than the other one. So it was more of a war of gods. And when you actually look in the Bible, in the Old Testament, when they switch between the words Lord and the word God, they're actually referencing two different gods, but that through translation, it just turned into like the same thing. Culturally, we now accept Lord and God to be the same entity. But back then, they were actually like two distinct names. So that was like super interesting. And he's quoting the Old Testament a lot in chapter 7, which is, it's interesting. I have difficulty with remembering those kinds of religions. I'm much more of a prehistory kind of person. And then chapter 8, God is 3, is about Christianity, which was really confusing for people. Apparently, first Christianity was seen as a sect of Judaism, which then it branched off away from there. And people were very confused about how there could be one God, and yet Jesus is also God. So this, like, really confused people. And it actually came down to this king who was very upset that there was this confusion. Constantine, he had taken over the region, and he was annoyed. He was a war person, he was in charge of military and stuff, and this whole religion thing was just annoying him. Basically. And he wanted, like, a final consensus. Like, is there one God, or is there two gods? Like, who is this Jesus guy? Like, it was very important for him for there to be one God, because then it would make sense for him to be one emperor and one person in charge. So that was, like, very important to him, but it was also, like, really important to a lot of the religious leaders to include Jesus as God. So the solution to this was that there's one God, but God appears in three entities, and that is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And this created so many more questions. It satisfied the new leader, but it did not satisfy many members of the church. But that's how the Trinity came to be, was because there was one person who very much wanted there to be one God, and there were many other people who wanted there to be two gods. So they created the Holy Trinity. Then chapter 9, God is All, is about Islam. They talk about a whole new war that's happening, of course. And it's basically explaining how Islam believes that God is everything because God created everything, which creates a lot of contradictions. They try to dehumanize God again, because Judaism tried to dehumanize God, and Christianity humanized it again. And now Islam is trying to dehumanize it. But then they give it many, like, human features. They give their deity Allah. They give, like, face and eyes and hands, and at least all these questions, like, how many eyes, how many hands, like, so many questions. And basically talks about how certain sects of Islam are basically, like, don't ask questions. About how, like, you read the Quran literally, and all of that jazz. And it was really interesting. It's like viewing like God as everything. I could definitely see some contradictions there, especially with like homosexuality. Like if God created homosexuality, then shouldn't you accept it too? I don't know. That was just like a few of like things that like going off in my head about like how you should accept everything if everything's created by God. It's very you belief. And then the conclusion, it was probably the most preachy. He is basically like describing like his religious journey with God, and about how this was like his journey from mainly focused on like Eurasia, and it like ended in Islam, just like how his path ended, and about how he sees God in everything, in like an essence form. So that was like, I really enjoyed it. I definitely would recommend this book. Let's see the cover again. I'm gonna give you guys the link. I definitely recommend this book to all the UUs I know. I'd recommend this book to academics. And I'd recommend this book to even the general public who's interested in religion. Okay, so thank you for listening.